Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and infertility. Well, the time has finally arrived for one of our most popular shows every year. It is our annual Adoption Tax Credit Show. I don't need to tell you that you're going to enjoy the show because anyone who is applying for the tax credit, I think anyone who is applying usually ends up listening to this show. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
When you look at the top of page 2, that's your adjusted gross income, and then your itemized or standard deductions and your personal exemptions. Then is your taxable income and what actual tax liability is. You know, we used to go to the tax books and look up what our tax liability was based on our taxable income. And that's what the adoption tax credit covers, that tax liability. And then, you know, what you do not use that first year, you can carry it forward for up to 5 years, but you must carry it forward yourself on that Form 8839 because the IRS will not carry it forward for you.
This show is brought to you by Creating a Family, the National Adoption and Infertility Education and Support nonprofit. We have a brand new e-guide on adoption announcements. It is such a fun, uplifting guide. It's mostly pictures, a little bit of text, but mostly pictures of ideas on how people announce their adoptions and when to announce your adoption. We cover all types of adoption, domestic infant, international foster. It is so fun. I really recommend that you get it, and it's free until the end of January. So grab it now. You can go to our website, creatingafamily.org, go to the Resources tab, click on eGuides, and you can get it. This show is brought to you and sponsored by Jockey Being Family Foundation. Their mission is to strengthen adoptive families through post-adoption services. As their founder, Deborah Waller, Chairman and CEO of Jockey International, says, one failed adoption is one too many. You can support their mission by buying a bear or a blanket at jockeybeingfamily.com, and we thank them for their support. Today we're going to be talking about the adoption tax credit. The federal tax code provides an adoption tax credit for up to $13,570. That's of qualified adoption expenses. That's a 2017 number for each child adopted, whether via public foster care or domestic private adoption or international adoption. Okay, that's the general information, but as we all know, the devil is in the details. So today, to help us figure out the details, we have two real experts on the adoption tax credit. One, Josh Kroll. He is the Adoption Subsidy Resource Center Coordinator at the North American Council on Adoptable Children, otherwise known as NACAC. We also have Becky Wilmoth. She is an adoption tax credit specialist at Bill's Tax Service. She is an enrolled agent and an adoption tax credit specialist in general. She travels nationwide to help educate adoptive families, agencies, caseworkers, and attorneys about how this credit can help them. So welcome both Becky and Josh to Creating a Family to help us understand more about this credit. It looks like for a while that the adoption tax credit was going to be removed entirely from the new tax bill, but thanks to some really great advocacy work by both of you and by the whole Save the Adoption Tax Credit Committee and community, the credit was left intact. And as I mentioned, the amount for 2017 is $13,570. All right, Becky, it is a tax credit. I think the first thing we have to understand is what is a credit and how does it differ from a deduction or some other form of tax savings?
Well, since it is a credit, what a credit does is it helps cover your tax liability after your taxable income has been determined. That tax credit, what it does, it helps cover that, and therefore you get your, withholding back, and then what you do not use of the credit, you can carry that forward for up to 5 years. What an actual deduction does, for instance, when you are able to itemize your deductions, what that does, that actually lowers your taxable income. So the difference is basically the deduction lowers your income. The credit helps cover the actual tax liability. And, of course, right now the adoption tax credit is not refundable. So what that means is it can cover your tax liability up to the maximum amount. For 2017 is $13,570. And then what you do not use, you can carry that forward for up to 5 years.
And just to be clear, if at the end of 5 years you don't have enough tax liability to use up the entire credit, then it goes away at that point. Is that how it works?
That is correct. You have 5 years after the initial year. So technically you could call it a 6-year credit, but it's 5 years to carry forward.
Gotcha. 5 carryover years plus the year you apply,
yeah.
So in total 6 years to utilize. Yeah, I understand what you're
Correct.
saying. All right, Josh, let's talk about the types of adoption that are included or excluded from being able to apply for the adoption tax credit.
Really, the only type of adoption that's excluded is adopting your spouse's child. Adopting from foster care, private domestic, or international are all covered by the adoption tax credit.
What about using donated embryos, which is sometimes called embryo adoption? Josh?
They talk about adopting a child, not an embryo. So I think you've asked this question before, but I've not seen the word embryo anywhere in this instructions. So
it's my understanding that it is not applicable. Right. Becky, have you heard anything different about embryo adoption? No,
it's not. The only way that there were 2 states a couple years ago that discussed it, and the only way that they could is to do a re-adoption after the child is born, and most of the parents that do that, in those 2 particular states, right? They don't want to.
Gotcha.
So I haven't heard anything other than that.
Okay, same here. All right. Now, I want to talk at the beginning about how the adoption tax credit differs for adoptions from foster care. We got we've got a general question. This is from Kay. She said, I'm confused on the federal adoption tax credit. I adopted this past month. The question was sent in earlier, so she adopted last fall. And my daughter qualifies for the maximum subsidy. However, I didn't pay any attorney's fees, and she is not disabled. Do I qualify for the adoption tax credit? Josh, let's let you answer this question, and in general,
sure.
Use Kay's question as a jumping off to explain how the adoption tax credit works with adoptions from foster care.
Okay. So most children who are adopted from foster care, not all, but most are going to qualify for adoption assistance. Some states call it adoption subsidy, but it's typically that monthly payment, or it could be just the Medicaid through the adoption assistance agreement. Also could include reimbursement of non-recurring. As long as the family is getting one of those things through an adoption assistance agreement, that is proof that the state has determined the child is special needs, even if the child doesn't have a disability, because it also means hard to place. And in that case, they will qualify for the full amount regardless of what they pay in expenses. So for this family, because they do get the adoption assistance, even though the child doesn't have a disability, they should indicate that the child is special needs on the adoption tax credit form 8839 and claim the full amount of the credit.
Now, you said there were a couple of things that would be used as proof that the child can fall under, quote, special needs, and that one was having a signed adoption subsidy agreement. The other one, I think you said, was receiving Medicaid.
Yeah, so you're going to have an adoption assistance agreement for all of them. What happens is, like my state of Minnesota, children who don't present, we don't have an age. A lot of states, kids qualify by age, like where Becky is. Children who are 1 year or older in Illinois DCFS care are eligible because they're 1 year old or older, and that's hard to place. But in Minnesota, we don't have an age. So if you have a young child who's being adopted who is at risk of problems in the future, they'll get signed an agreement with 0 monthly payment, but they'll get Medicaid with that signed agreement, and that will be enough for the IRS. So they have to have a signed agreement and get some benefit, whether it's the monthly payment, the Medicaid, or the reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses. But all of them will have to have a signed agreement with the state.
Okay, and so even if you have a deferred assistance where I'm not sure that my child is going to need, but it was prenatal exposure or whatever, and so you have an adoption assistance agreement. It is signed, but you're not getting any money. But your child does get Medicaid, and that would again qualify your child as special needs under the adoption tax credit. But what about, as Kay says, I didn't pay anything out. It didn't cost me anything.
Right.
Most adoptions from foster care don't cost the adoptive parents anything.
Right. And when the children are considered special needs, which is what we just covered, is you're getting an adoption assistance agreement with one of those 3 benefits, then they qualify for the full amount regardless of out-of-pocket expenses. And that's spelled out very clearly on line 1, column D, as well as in line 5 of the instructions under special needs adoptions.
All right. So even if you still get to claim the credit, even if you haven't spent any money, if your child qualifies as special needs. And in order to qualify for special needs, your child has to have an adoption assistance agreement and receive some type of benefit, which would include something like Medicaid. Did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah, you nailed it perfectly.
Okay,
yes,
great.
Perfect.
All right. Becky, let's address Kelly's question. She says, what happens if you complete 2 separate adoptions in 1 year? Or what if I wait and they are in 2 consecutive years? Okay, so that's what she's asking, and I would like for you to expand that also for how does it work when adopting siblings at the same time. Becky?
You qualify, it's per child. So if you adopted 2 children in the year of 2017, you would actually qualify for the adoption tax credit for both of them. So you would actually have a $27,140 credit for that year. Or if you have one year and one the next year, you would obviously use the first one up first, and then you would go to the second one. And you would want to keep track of when each one would run out, and then you would use the next one. But it is per child. That's the great thing about it is if it's twins, they both qualify. Or if you have 2 successful adoptions, in the same year, they would both qualify.
Okay.
So, and I just want to tag on to something that you and Josh were talking about. What you and I consider special needs and what the IRS considers special needs is 2 complete different things. Where generally in the question that the person presented about they don't have any disability, what the IRS considers special needs is hard to place. And each state has a different criteria to what that is. But that subsidy agreement, again, I want to emphasize it just like you guys have. That subsidy agreement is the key. You've got to have that signed subsidy agreement. Whether no expenses or not, they'll qualify.
Excellent. Yes. All right.
This is Josh. I want to add one thing to what Becky just said because that's really good to stress. The other thing is we know that there were families who have claimed children as special needs because without a doubt everybody in the world would consider them special needs because they have a disability and it's very clear. But if they don't have that agreement, for the purposes of the IRS, the state didn't make that determination. They should only do it based on out-of-pocket expenses, not as a special needs adoption.
Exactly. Which means that they get the credit regardless of expenses or lack of expenses. Yeah, exactly.
And then on the sibling thing, I don't think this happens a lot, but I definitely have run into it. I know it won't happen with Becky because I know she knows her stuff as well as anybody. But thankfully there are families out there that adopt more than 3 sibling groups of 3. And there are only spots for 3 children on Form 8839. Back through 2009, it was only 2 children on that form. And in those situations, if I adopted a sibling group of 5, I would actually fill out 2 forms, 8839,
correct.
so I could have all 5 children on there. So
that is correct.
That's very clear in the instructions, but that is something that tax preparers that are not as experienced as Becky have definitely missed in my experience.
Yeah, and it is not unusual to adopt a sibling group larger than 3. So, yeah, good point. Okay, excellent. So how far back can you go to claim the adoption tax credit? We have a question from Kim. She said, I adopted in 2013. Can I go back and claim the expenses on my 2017 taxes? Becky. With the adoption tax credit, the refundable part, you can only go back 3 years. But with the adoption tax credit, you can actually go back 5 years, but you will not get a refund for those first 2 years, okay? But you can use the carry forward that you would have. If you did not use it all in those first 2 years and you still have some to carry to the last 3, you can carry it forward, but you will not be able to get a refund on those first 2 years.
Just to clarify, when she said refundable, she meant you can't get a refund for those earlier years, not that it was a refundable credit. Right. You can't get a refund for the taxes you paid in the earlier years, not correct. As I understand. Yeah, okay, got it. So let's say, as I understood her question, she did not apply for the adoption tax credit. She's wondering, and if I hear you right, yes, she can go back, but if she's already paid the taxes, she'll just have to utilize it up in the carryover. So the way it works is – go ahead. So in 2013, because that is a closed year right now, she would have to file for it and use up whatever she could that year but not get a refund because it's closed. But 14 is still open, and 15 and 16, so if she could carry forward and use any of it to increase the size of her refund in 14, 15, or 16, she could then get a refund for those years. Okay.
And she would have to do it by April the 15th of this year.
Okay.
Or lose what the 2014 amount would be lost if she did not. All
right. Well, listen up, Kim. Don't be late on your taxes. All right. Now, we always have a lot of questions about what is considered a qualified adoption expense, because that's the term that's used in the statute and in the regs. So, one question that we often hear is about failed domestic adoption attempt expenses. Are those allowed under the adoption tax credit? Let's say you've tried to adopt domestically, a private adoption, and it did not, and you were not successful, but you spent money. What happens to those expenses? Let's see. I can't remember who I last asked. So let's see, Becky. I'll send this one to you.
If you have a failed adoption, one of the things that you need to remember is you have 2 options, actually. Let's say, for instance, you paid the expenses in 2016. You could not take them until you do your 2017 return. You have to wait a year before you can take those expenses for an adoption that is not final or that has failed. And it will have to go paper. Your tax return will have to go paper because you do not have a Social Security number to tag to that failed adoption. And then when you have a successful adoption after that, the amount of credit that you received from that failed adoption has to be deducted from the successful credit that you receive when you have a successful adoption. The other option is you can combine those expenses of the failed adoption with the successful adoption and then claim that whenever you claim your successful adoption for the adoption tax credit.
So it's not a separate, even in your mind, it is a separate thing, but for the purposes of the of the tax credit, all attempts go towards one to the successful adoption when it happens. What about if you are never able to successfully adopt, or you just decide to give up? Becky, at that point, can you try to recoup those expenses?
Well, you can. It will just be for the maximum amount. You can't go any higher than what the maximum amount is of that year.
Yeah. Okay.
And you need to claim them the year after you paid those expenses.
Correct.
Okay. And you'll never have a Social Security number for the child, obviously, because there is no child. But you could still claim them, even if you. But now, if you decide then to go back to adopt, then you still have to go back and incorporate and realize that that the credit was used on the attempt.
Correct. And then you start over. Once you've had a successful one, you basically start over again.
Okay. What about failed international adoption expenses? Are those allowed under the adoption tax credit?
No.
No.
Go out. I'll send this one to Josh. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The answer is the same. It's no.
All right. So, what about birth mother expenses, or the actual term should be expectant mom or expectant mother expenses? Certain states allow, and different states allow different amounts. Are they allowed as a qualified adoption expense, Becky?
No, they are not. Not on the federal adoption tax credit. There is some states that will give you a credit on your state return, but they are not allowed on the federal. Those must be taken off the top of the expenses because they are not qualified expenses on the federal adoption tax credit.
Okay. When we received a question and they did not give their name, if I took a vacation for bonding to see if the child would be a good fit for our family to decide if we wanted to complete the adoption, would their vacation expenses be a qualified adoption expense? Josh?
Using the term vacation probably would invalidate it if they were saying this was a required pre-placement visit and they had to pay expenses to go and visit and do a pre-placement visit to see if the match would work, then I would say yes. But if you call it a vacation, I'm going to probably say no.
That would be my guess as well. Just, from my experience with the IRS.
But there are definitely situations, especially with foster care, where you might be matched with the child, and before they, especially if you're at a distance, they want you to do some pre-placement visits, and there can be travel expenses, and those are definitely legitimate for pre-placement visits. But if you call it a vacation for bonding, that, calling it a vacation would definitely not fly.
All right. So, Becky, just kind of summarize then what all is included with a qualified adoption expense. Our agency fees, our attorney fees, what is, just if you can give us a kind of the crib note version of what they mean by qualified adoption expense.
According to IRS code, qualified adoption expenses are reasonable and necessary expenses directly related or for the principal purpose of legal adoption. It can include adoption fees, attorney fees, court costs, travel expenses, readoption expenses, in-country. A lot of times they are required for international adoptions. They're required to have a cell phone in-country strictly for the orphanage, postage, your dossier, physicals. There are just so many expenses, but the key words to remember are reasonable and necessary expenses related to the adoption. It's very clear what is not qualified expenses, birth mother expenses, surrogate parenting agreements. One thing that I want to also say is, mileage. You cannot take mileage for the adoption tax credit. However, keep your gas receipts. I know that sounds crazy when it comes to IRS, but there is not a mileage rate for adoption. So
I can check this later, but I've been told, at least when it was refundable, we had a family that was doing quite frequent pre-placement visits for a foster care adoption, and they were able to do mileage. And I can track that down and get you the information on that. But that was straight from an IRS attorney.
Okay. I have in the past questioned that with the IRS and was told gas receipts instead of mileage. So
I have heard the same. I've heard the same. But
generally, that is, you have so many other expenses.
Yeah, I was just thinking, for most adoptions, you're going to be well over the amount. So you're
right.
Correct.
And that was something I was going to say is I wouldn't sweat the little stuff if the big things get you over the maximum amount.
Exactly.
And so don't push the envelope. For most adoptions, you're going to be over the amount. There are exceptions to that, but non-foster adoptions, I should say.
Yeah. And the other thing,
go ahead.
The one other thing I want to say on expenses, if you get reimbursed by your employer for the expenses, or for foster care adoption, well, this is kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. Never mind. Well, the reimbursement of non-recurring, those wouldn't be things, but if you're getting reimbursement non-recurring, then it's special needs and you don't have to document expenses. But those also are things that don't count as expenses.
So the main one that comes up we do hear where employers, so what happens, summarize again, Josh, what you were saying. There are definitely employers who give you an adoption credit, or not credit, I'm sorry, a benefit, a monetary benefit. So how is that? That has to come off of your expenses before you claim them. Is that correct?
Correct. And what happens? So let's say I have my adoption cost $20,000, and I have $5,000 in adoption employer benefits. So what will happen is I will exclude the $5,000, so it doesn't count as income, and then I will claim expenses for the credit of $15,000.
Got it. Okay. All right. So that's and fortunately we have more. That's happening more with more employers, so that's a great thing. All right. Now let's move to talking about the when. When can you claim the adoption tax credit? And for this, I want to break it into the different types of adoption. Let's start with foster care. So for Becky, for foster care adoption, when can you claim? Let's say the child has been living with you prior to the adoption. So when do you claim the foster care adoption credit?
You can claim the adoption tax credit for a foster care after it is final. It has to be final, and we'll talk about documentation and stuff later. But the foster care has to be final before you can claim the adoption tax credit.
Okay, perfect. Now, that's easy enough. Now let's talk about domestic infant or private domestic infant adoption. Josh, we've got a couple of questions. Let me read this one. One is from Barb. She said, this is our first child to adopt, so I don't know when to file for the credit. We paid a lot of agency fees in 2017, but the baby will be placed in our home in 2018 with final fees due then. So which tax year do we file for the credit? Thank you for your help. Use Barb's question as kind of a general launching pad to talk about the wins for domestic infant private adoption.
Sure. For that family, in that scenario, it will be 2018. So for the private domestic adoption, this is sort of builds off the unsuccessful part. For private domestic adoptions, if the adoption's not final, they can take expenses. They can claim expenses as credit the year after they pay them if it's not final yet. So if that family had paid their first expenses in 2016, they could take those on their 2017 taxes. In the year of finalization, you take both that year's as well as the prior year. So if they finalize in 2018, the expenses paid in 2017 and 2018 take place. And I'm going to knock on wood, if for some reason that adoption didn't happen in 2018, they would still be able to take the expenses they paid in 2017 on their 2018 taxes because it would be a domestic private and they're taking it the year after they paid it. So no matter what, that family will be able to claim whatever they paid in 2017 on their 2018 taxes, even if it did not become final.
And so with domestic infant adoptions, the adoption does not have to be final in order to claim the expenses that have incurred the previous year.
Correct.
Did I say that correctly? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
All right. Now moving on to the wins of international adoption, when the credit can be taken. Becky, talk to us about if you're adopting internationally, when the experiences. In fact, I've got a question, and I'll read that, and you can use that as kind of a jumping. She says, we are in a lengthy international adoption process, and the expenses will span several years before the adoption is finalized. Our first question is, does the adoption have to be finalized before we claim the tax credit?
Yes.
Okay.
It does have to be final on international, but what you do, you accumulate all those expenses and add them together, and then whenever the adoption is final, you can take that credit, up to the maximum amount, and hopefully if they have an employer benefit, they can exclude some of that, and then they can take the credit, but they just can't do it for the same expenses.
And you answered her second question with that, so that's perfect. Now we got a question from Robin, and she says, do our children have to be in the U.S. on January 1, or is it enough if we have our adoption decree? And I think that the question is getting to what do we mean by a finalized adoption. Apparently it has been finalized in the country, if I'm understanding her correctly. It's finalized in the country of origin, but the children are not here in the U.S. So, Becky, thoughts on that?
They have to be a U.S. citizen. So it depends on what country. Generally, they have to be in the United States, and they have to be a U.S. citizen. Josh, do you have any different thoughts?
Yeah, there's two revenue procedures. One's for Hague countries and one's not. But I just pulled up the one for Hague countries, and it says adoption finalized in another convention country. If a taxpayer is within the scope of this revenue procedure, the Internal Revenue Service will not challenge the taxpayer treatment of the adoption that is finalized in another convention country. Sending country is final in the taxable year that either the sending country enters a final decree or the Secretary of State issues a certificate under 301A of the AAA. So it seems to me like the child doesn't physically have to be in the U.S. if the other country had entered into the final decree.
As long as it's a Hague final.
But
that's
how would the
Hague, yeah. I haven't pulled up the other one.
I'm sorry.
Pardon me?
But how would the child have U.S. citizenship?
I didn't see that as a requirement in this.
Okay, I misunderstood.
I'm just reading what Revenue Procedure 2010-31 says.
And Becky, is that your understanding as well, that if it's a Hague country, and by that we mean a country that is also a member of the Hague Treaty on Intercountry Adoption, which the U.S. is a member of. Thoughts on anything to add to that, Becky?
The biggest issue, what I have run into personally, and I do hundreds every year, is whether or not they were, for dependency reasons, whether or not they were a citizen, U.S. citizen, the last 6 months of the year. Of course, that all depends on when they brought them home, generally. But some countries, they're issued as soon as they have that final Hague certificate, they are considered a U.S. citizen. In general, I would say most of the time it's when they are actually here. But that would definitely have to take some more research.
Yeah, I mean, there's no direct link between dependency and claiming children for the adoption tax credit.
Correct.
So
That's
when you raise,
saying.
So the residents being physically here or a citizen, I don't think necessarily transfers to the adoption credit.
Right, and generally, most of the time, when you have an adoption tax credit, they may qualify for that, that year because they were home. Whether they were home December 30th or 31st, they would still qualify for the adoption tax credit, but they may not, qualify for the dependency. But that's another separate issue. But generally, what I have seen is it just depends on the country.
Okay,
they're
and that
considered.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I interrupted. I apologize. Were you finished then?
Yes.
Okay. That raises. We actually did get a question from Carly, and I will ask it now. And it's a question not so much on the adoption tax credit, but claiming your child as a dependent. She says, we took placement of our daughter in July. We finalized in January. Can we claim her as a dependent on our federal income taxes? Our agency technically has custody until finalization, if that matters to the answer. Josh, thoughts on that?
I need to know when the child was born, because the issue there is going to be the residency test. If the child is an infant and was born that year, and they have the child for more than half the year in their physical custody, then they would qualify as dependents. I mean, assuming, under age 19 and, placed for the purpose of adoption would meet the relationship test. The child doesn't have their own resources supporting them. But, I mean, the key thing that we would need to know is how, was the child born during the year or not? Because
if the child, let's answer it both ways. If the child was born in July and they took a placement of the child from the hospital, which is typical, what would be the answer there?
Most likely it's going to be a yes.
And if the child was an older child that they took placement of in July, what would be the answer there?
I would have to count the days, but if they're not over 183 in a non-leap year, or they're not 183, then the answer is no, because they can't meet the residency test. Okay.
So it kind of depends there on the residency issue. All right?
Yeah. I agree.
All right. Let's talk about income levels. Becky, what income level is excluded from claiming the adoption tax credit, and what is the cutoff where it starts being reduced?
For 2017, the income phase-out range starts at $203,540, and then the cutoff is actually $243,540. There's a $40,000 dollar range in there for the phase-outs. So what basically means if you're under the $203,540, you would be well qualified for the full amount. And then as you go through that range, that $40,000 range, it will cut off in increments, and then once you get to the $243,540, you're completely disqualified.
And how do they determine your income? And because many people receive bonuses, and the bonuses are paid. Sometimes they're paid in the year of, but sometimes they're paid the following year. So how does that work? It's a performance budget bonus, and so how does that work? If obviously if it was paid in the same year, then it would be considered. But what if it was paid in the following year? How do you determine the salary?
It's the year that it's final, and it is your modified adjusted gross income. So at the bottom of your front page of your federal 1040 is your adjusted gross income, and then anything that was taken out, exempt interest or like student loan interest deduction, Social Security, the full amount of those things are added back then to come to your modified adjusted gross income of the year that it's final. That is the determination.
Okay, so just follow their very specific criteria, regulatory criteria that you have to follow. So whatever's on that line is what it is.
And I just want to make one slight distinction. The income test, as Becky said, is only applied, she said, when it's finalized, but it's the year you're claiming the credit. It doesn't get applied to carry forward.
I apologize.
Yeah, no, I know. But for those folks that are doing domestic adoptions and taking it the year after they paid it and it's not finalized, it would be claimed each year. And if they were over income in some of those years, they should not claim it those years so that they have more credit available to them in a year that hopefully they're under income.
Well, that's a weird hope.
That's what I meant here. I'm claiming it. I apologize.
No, I know you did. I knew. I was just wanting to clarify for the listeners.
Thank you.
I knew you meant
Thank
that.
you. I appreciate that.
All right. Now, let's talk about the adoption tax credit, how it works with self-employment taxes. Josh, thoughts on that? That's something that often trips people up and really gets under people's skin.
It doesn't. The adoption tax credit reduces your tax liability, which is on line 47 of the 1040, and the self-employment tax gets added back in after the regular non-refundable credits are applied, and so that other tax, self-employment on line 57, does not get reduced by the adoption tax credit.
Yeah, we get questions on that almost every year. All
yep.
right. Okay.
It's very disappointing for folks.
It is if you're self-employed. It certainly is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess we will live to fight that battle another time. Let's talk about documentation. All right, Becky, what type of documentation should you submit with your taxes? And then my next question, so you can answer them both at the same time if you want, is going to be what type of documentation should you keep in your records? So let's make a distinction there. All right, take it away.
Okay. Right now, the Form 8839 can be electronically filed with your regular return, so you do not have to submit any documentation at this time. Now, if the IRS requests more information, each type of adoption has a different set of documentation that you need to keep. I always recommend that you have a large envelope that is marked IRS documentation. Keep good copies in there, and then if they request it, of course, don't ever send the originals. Always send a good copy. For all adoptions, you want to keep in that envelope the final judgment of adoption. That's for all adoptions. Now, for foster care, if you have a foster care adoption, you want to keep your final judgment of adoption and your subsidy agreement that declares the child's special needs that you're claiming the credit for through the foster care system. Different states call it different things. Some states call it adoption assistance eligibility determination, but it's basically the signed subsidy agreement. You need to keep that final judgment of adoption and that signed subsidy agreement in an envelope. Now, if it is a domestic adoption, you want to keep a good copy of your home study, the final judgment of adoption, and all of your documentation for qualified expenses. And the same thing for international. You want to keep your final judgment of adoption, your home study, and then all your qualified expenses. You need to keep a copy of those. And if you ever do have to send documentation into the IRS, this is something that we have learned over the many years of doing this. Whoever is the primary taxpayer on that tax return, put their Social Security number in red Sharpie on the top of every piece of paper that you send in as far as documentation if the IRS requests more documentation. You know, in years past, the biggest problem is some people didn't have the right documentation or didn't know what to send in, particularly whenever it was refundable in 2010 and 2011. Documentation was a huge issue. So if you just remember those three things that you need and put it in that envelope, and then if you ever need it, you know that you have it in a safe place.
So, Becky, can I ask a question for your advice?
Sure. Sure.
In the refundable years, I mean, part of the problem was the IRS didn't know what they were looking for. I mean, that's just be acknowledged that failure and the challenges for those years. But when they were doing the correspondence audits with families requesting the documentation and expenses, it seemed like the IRS was asking not only for bills but proof that families paid those bills. Would you recommend that so I shouldn't just keep a copy of agency A charged me $3,000, but I have a bank statement or credit card statement that says I paid that $3,000?
I agree wholeheartedly, Josh.
Okay.
Because the IRS they don't want to know what's billed. They want to know what is paid. So if you write a check, make a copy of that check, attach it to that bill or that invoice from your agency. That way you have proof, or a credit card statement that's proving that you paid your flight with it. Different things, because that's exactly true. The IRS, when it comes to expenses and you're having to show documentation for expenses, they want to know what's paid, not what is billed.
Something else that I have heard is that with the receipts, if the electronic receipts that you get will often fade over the years,
Yes.
so it makes sense to make a copy when the copy will still pick up and have that filed as well in case 5 years from now it has faded. I don't know if the current receipts are as prone to fading, but it seems like that's a reasonable thing to keep doing.
That's what I highly recommend to all of my international adoption clients, is because just for some reason international receipts, they fade quickly. So when you get home, if you don't have a good copy, or go to Staples or Kinko's somewhere and just make one, good copy of everything, so you have it in case you need it.
Okay, perfect. Let's talk now about the issue of Social Security numbers. Is that required? What if you don't have one when you're filing? Josh, just give us a summary of how to deal with the Social Security number issue, and what if you're changing your child's Social Security number, which sometimes happens in foster care adoption.
Let's build off of the private, domestic, not finalized, or unsuccessful adoptions, because Becky had mentioned earlier that you will have to paper file. If the software can't enter in a Social Security number into that part on line 1 of Form 8839, you can't e-file, so you'll have to paper file. So if you're in process for domestic adoption, you should do C attachment and then provide information, including contact information, address, and phone number for the agency or attorney or facilitator that you're using. If you have a child identified but you don't have the Social Security number and you don't want to hold off, you can apply for ATIN numbers, adoption taxpayer identification numbers. I'm not as familiar with that, but maybe Becky is. But before I hand that over to her, if you're changing the Social Security numbers, what the IRS folks have told us in wage and examination, the folks that process it, is within 2 weeks' time they have updated information from the Social Security Administration that has information about the child, if the name has changed, and if the numbers change. Those are all things that they can access in their records. So if you were to change it, they can look that up. And generally they have that access to that information within 2 weeks. I think that sort of covered what you had, but maybe Becky knows more about the ATIN.
You file with the old number, and as soon as it's updated, you notify them, and at that point they will be notified from Social Security as well. Did I understand you correctly?
I would suspect that if it doesn't match what they have, they are able to identify it within the system because of the access between the two government agencies. Okay.
And Becky, so what is a taxpayer identification number, and how does when should we worry about using that?
You can use an ATIN for domestic adoptions if they are not final, and you can apply and take the documentation needed to the Social Security office to get an. But one thing I want you to remember, ATINs and ITINs can expire, so you need to make sure and go ahead and get the Social Security card as soon as your child qualifies for one. I have had them expire before, and the clients didn't realize it, and so we had to wait for a Social Security. As Josh said, Social Security records are updated pretty quickly. So even if you don't have the new Social Security card or the new Social Security number, you can generally go to your local Social Security office, and they will give you a statement right there, stamped Social Security Administration, with the updated information. So, it shouldn't take very long generally to get that new Social Security card. But yes, you can apply for an ATIN for for a domestic.
If you have the option of getting a Social Security number, wouldn't you recommend that they go ahead and do that?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So it's only if you are in one of those weird situations where it's just not an option that you need to worry,
right.
And then you need some type of number. Okay. All right. Now I want to talk, we're getting more questions, and this is not a surprise because we're seeing more kinship adoptions, but we are getting more questions, so I wanted to kind of carve out a period of time and to ask specific questions to kinship adoption. All right, this one comes from Sheila. She says, we have 3 grandchildren in our care. One was given to us through DCF. We have permanent guardianship of him. The other 2, we have temporary custody by extended family. The one that we have permanent guardianship over is disabled. We started his adoption, and we've already spent about $5,000. The other 2, we started their adoption, and because their biomom won't consent, their adoption will take more money. So far, we've spent approximately $20,000. Both of these children have special needs: PTSD, autism, sensory processing disorder, etc. Lots of therapies and things like that. She wants to know if they would qualify for the tax credit. I'm going to toss this one to you, Josh. It's complicated, but it's a good summary of some of the problems kinship providers are finding. The first question is, she's got children. It looks like, if I'm understanding, she has 1 grandchild that was placed with them through foster care. She has 2 that it looks like were not placed with them with her through foster care. She had got custody from the family member. So thoughts on that distinction and how it plays out with the adoption tax credit?
So kinship often gets things more complicated, but really what folks need to look at here is it isn't that complicated. The fact that they had a pre-existing relationship doesn't change how they get treated tax-wise. So for this family, if the one was placed by foster care and they were able to get adoption assistance for that child, they would be able to get the full amount of the credit no matter how much they paid. But if they get no adoption assistance for that child, and obviously for the other 2, then they will only qualify for the credit based on what they paid out of pocket in adoption expenses.
And in this case, they are the 2 that were not placed through foster care. Their expenses are going to be in excess. They've already spent in excess of what the credit would be. So they would just, at this point,
they'd be limited.
They would be limited to with the amount of the credit, but at this point they would simply apply as a non-foster care adoption. Am I correct?
Or private domestic adoption, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And for
so if the family wants to reach out to me, or if you want to connect me with them, I can try and help them with the possibility of getting adoption assistance for any of those kids. But that's a different conversation for a different show.
Right. Yeah. That is. Okay, so we will, all right, so the distinction, the first thing you just have to think through is whether or not the children have come through foster care. And then the second question, if they do, is do you have an adoption assistance agreement? If that's the case, then you are eligible for the credit regardless of expenses. If you do not have an adoption assistance agreement, then they're not considered special needs, or if you have not, they were not placed with you through foster care, then they will not be. You won't be getting assistance, and they won't be special needs, and so you just apply as if it were a traditional adoption, a private domestic adoption. All right. Our second question is from Michelle. She says, I've had custody of my nephews for 8 years and would like to adopt them. Can I claim them under the adoption tax credit? Becky, following up on our trying to uncomplicate kinship adoption, how would you advise Michelle?
Yes, she absolutely can. It would be for expenses only, unless they are through the foster care system and have that subsidy agreement. if it would be just considered strictly a private domestic adoption and would it be for expenses.
Okay. Another question we get, it concerns whether oftentimes, extended family members have guardianship, but they have not filed to adopt the children. They just have guardianship. Josh, does that make a difference under the adoption tax credit?
Well, I do get the call not as frequently as I used to, but this is an adoption credit. So if all they're doing is guardianship, this doesn't apply to them. If they're, like the first family, if they're already fighting to adopt those two and they've paid expenses out and it's not finalized yet, they can claim that, even though they're currently in a guardianship situation. But if they're not pursuing adoption, this credit does not apply. If I understood the question right.
You did, yeah, and that's exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you understood it correctly. We get this question. It's interesting. We get it because there are often reasons that grandparents have not chosen to our extended family, have not chosen to go through with an adoption, and they believe it is to the child's best interest or their best interest or the child's parents' best interest to just be a guardian. And it may be, that's not the point. The point is, however, this is an adoption tax credit, not a guardianship tax credit. Okay. Becky, hopefully not putting you on the spot, are there any questions that you are getting that we have not answered about the adoption tax credit?
The biggest question that I always get is, we've covered the self-employment tax. Unfortunately, since it's not refundable right now, it does not cover self-employment tax. But just basically, how does it work? How does it actually work on my tax return? And so, that's Josh did a great job explaining, the credit a while ago, and I appreciate that so much because a lot of people, unfortunately, don't really look at their tax return. And so when I get on the phone with them, I explain to them, when you look at the top of page 2, that's your adjusted gross income, and then your itemized or standard deductions and your personal exemptions. Then is your taxable income and what actual tax liability is. We used to go to the tax books and look up what our tax liability was based on our taxable income. And that's what the adoption tax credit covers, that tax liability. And then, what you do not use that first year, you can carry it forward for up to 5 years, but you must carry it forward yourself on that Form 8839 because the IRS will not carry it forward for you. So you just need to make sure and follow through with the details. You said it at the beginning, the devil is in the details, and it's just one of those things that you have to stay on top of yourself. So to make sure that you get the full use of the credit, whether it's through the income exclusion, through an employer benefit, or whether it's through the tax credit part of it. Just remember that, it is a great credit, but you have to follow through with it.
Okay, Josh, Becky, thank you. I think that you summarized that so well that people don't really understand how a credit works, and I think that fundamentally it makes for a lot of confusion. Go ahead, Josh.
So I think it feels like I'm prompted I should give my standard example. If that's okay, I can do it in 2 minutes. So
sure, no, absolutely.
So let's say that NACAC withholds $4,000 from my paychecks. That shows up on my W-2 as my federal income tax withholding. I go and do my taxes. Tax tables say, Josh, you owe $3,000. I don't have alternative minimum tax, and I don't have premium repayment related to the Affordable Care Act. Those three things, for most people, it's just the tax tables, equal your tax liability. And I have no other credits. I have no other taxes. In a normal year, if the tax tables say, Josh, you owe $3,000 and I had $4,000 withheld, I get a refund of $1,000 because I overpaid $1,000. I paid $4,000. I only owed $3,000. I get that refunded. I adopt a kid. those numbers magically stay the same. They really wouldn't, but magically we'll say they stay the same. I claim $13,570. I use $3,000 of that to offset the $3,000 that I owe from the tax tables, the tax liability line 47, and now I get refunded all $4,000 of mine that I had withheld, and I carry forward like Christmas leftovers $10,570 to the next tax year.
And the bonus, here's the bonus, child tax credit, the $1,000 until next year, it's still $1,000.
Yeah.
That was a credit after you adopted that child is also bumped down to additional child tax credit, which is refundable, so you'll get another $1,000 back also.
Correct. I always, in my examples, adopt teenagers, 17-year-olds, so I ignore that part. But yes, for those people, I do. When I talk to people who clearly are paying attention to their taxes, I say, if you notice the child tax credit disappears and that freaks you out, someone who actually looks at their 1040 every year, just look down online. Usually it's 67 at additional child tax credit. And if that amount shows up there, it's all good. It means you get more money back and you're using the adoption credit quicker. Yeah.
Well, so Becky, if you have carryover for the adoption tax credit, should you adjust your withholdings to reflect that?
I have many clients that do. The one thing that I remind them of is if you adjust your withholding, that's great. But just remember, when you're getting ready to run out of adoption tax credit, make sure and change it back, because you don't want to be stuck with a big tax bill the year that your first year that you don't have any more adoption tax credit. So, I keep a pretty close eye on it with all of my clients. But, for everybody out there, please, if you adjust your withholding, make sure you follow through with the amount, how much you're using, how much you have left, and the year that it's going to be gone, make sure and switch your W-4 back.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. The other thing I would say with that is sometimes folks ask a very common misconception. It's like, well, I'm not using up, or I won't be able to use up all the adoption credit in 6 years, so what can I do to change it? Can I change my withholding so I use it up more quickly? And that doesn't work that way. Because what you need to change is the tax liability, not what's withheld, to be able to use up more of the adoption credit. So that's a very common misconception question that I get for a decade now.
For a decade now. Yeah, I guess at some point
I've been helping people since 2004. I'm not, unlike Becky, I'm not an actual tax professional. Becky is.
Right. It was just how you said it with a bit of a sigh there that made me laugh.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Josh Kroll and Becky Wilmoth, for talking with us today and explaining this. To get more information from either of them, you can go to billstaxservice.com or to NACAC, NACAC.org. I want to remind you that this show is brought to you by the generous support of our partners. One of our wonderful gold sponsors or partners, either one, is Children's Connection. They are an adoption agency providing services for domestic infant adoption and embryo donation and adoption throughout the U.S., as well as providing home studies and post-adoption support to families in Texas. For those of you listening today, keep in mind that the advice here was general. You will need to confirm this with your tax professionals when you're actually applying for the tax credit. But this is a great starting place. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next week.
Your hands were made for greatness. Mighty hands for painting, paneling, and clicking the Submit Order button on HomeDepot.com to get that duvet. And these Egyptian cotton towels delivered right to your door. Do more with decor at the Home Depot. Save up to 30% on select bedding and bath. Now at HomeDepot.com. More saving, more kinds of doing. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Enter promo code BEDBATH15 at purchase for an extra 15% off. Visit HomeDepot.com for more information. Your hands were made for greatness. Mighty hands for painting, paneling, and clicking the Submit Order button on HomeDepot.com to get that duvet. And these Egyptian cotton towels delivered right to your door. Do more with decor at the Home Depot. Save up to 30% on select bedding and bath. Now at HomeDepot.com. More saving, more kinds of doing. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Enter promo code BEDBATH15 at purchase for an extra 15% off. Visit HomeDepot.com for more information.